In just a moment, I'll read Exodus 17, verses 1 through 7, which is one segment of the greater story of the wilderness journey of the people of Israel as they traveled from Egypt into the land of Canaan. But before I read the story, just a brief description about my own journey into this text. Many, many years ago, I made the decision, having wonderful mentoring by the pastor of my childhood, that the Holy Spirit could lead you in advance. I prepared sermon topics and titles a year in advance for the last 15 to 20 years, understanding as I passed them along to the worship leader that 4 or 5 of those might change. For example, in 2001, when 9/11 hit, I was preaching on something totally unrelated to 9/11. The whole world was in shock, and like many, I turned to passages that give strength. And on that Sunday morning, I stood before the congregation and read, "Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord." And the sermon was improvised after those tragic events. Throughout this week, since last Saturday, in putting flesh to the bones of this text, I've been marveling that this is the text for this week. There's probably no other text I would have chosen to give us the background, to give us the encouragement, and to amplify the relevance of this day in the midst of current world events than this cluster of stories. Now, speaking of cluster of stories, the Wilderness Diaries, the narrative of the wilderness, you will find in the book of Numbers, chapters 13 through 19, and you will find them in Exodus chapter 15, all the way through chapter 19, which gives us a summary or recap of this ancient journey. But sometimes the ancient becomes even more relevant, and we see history repeating itself or unfolding or informing the day in which we live. So hear these words, hopefully words that become an inspiration and an encouragement, but also words that fortify our hope and our trust and address our grief and our dilemma as we sit on the sidelines this week. Beginning in verse 1 of Exodus 17, the whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Speaking of wilderness experiences, you probably know that you can stop by the Welcome Center at Fannin County Chamber of Commerce in Blue Ridge, Georgia, to get a trail map for the Cohutta Wilderness area. 40,000 acres of some of the most pristine wilderness and unique wildlife in the world. Rugged mountain terrains and beautiful hiking trails. And it's the largest wilderness area east of the Mississippi, right here in the state of Georgia. Well, from the wilderness diaries in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Numbers and the book of Exodus, we can learn some valuable lessons which help us through the desolate experiences of our life and help us as we navigate some of the most concerning experiences of our day. In the middle of this Exodus narrative in the Old Testament, there's a story about Israel's journey through multiple wildernesses. We say it's a wilderness, but there were 3 to 5 different wildernesses that the children of Israel crossed, including at a minimum the wilderness of Sin, which is mentioned in this text, the wilderness of Sinai, which is primarily across the Sinai Peninsula, and the wilderness of Zin, which is just to the east of Gaza today. Moses and his followers, as you read, had a crash course in wilderness training. They marched through rugged terrain, they slept under the stars, and they ate whatever rations they could gather. Wilderness experiences are tough, literally and metaphorically, but they tend to make people stronger. Bring it forward to our day. Socially, economically, and perhaps even spiritually, most of us think more about getting to the promised land than we do about preparing for the wilderness experiences of a life. For most of us, our wilderness experiences in the grand scheme of things have been fairly brief and maybe even mild, certainly compared to the children of Israel and even the people of Israel and Palestine today. But for all of us, an examination of Israel's experiences can better prepare us for whatever challenges we may be facing now or for the challenges our world faces in the future. Everyone, every human being of every age, from the adolescent to the aging, has had or will have a wilderness experience at some point in life. A wilderness experience can be a metaphor for unexplored territory. It can refer to a season of life when God seems to be silent or even absent. Or it can be a point of reference for a season of change or transition that's extremely tough or difficult. Practically speaking, people may speak of a season of life as a wilderness for a lot of different reasons. Maybe they're grappling with an illness. Maybe they're going through the wilderness of grief over the death of someone they love. Maybe they're acclimating to new economic realities. Maybe they're caught up in vocational downsizing or transition. Maybe they're just in a season of spiritual barrenness. Or maybe they're going through a midlife crisis, a time of intense stress, duress, or even distress. Or maybe even a time of transition in their family life. One of my favorite devotional writers and yours, Frederick Buechner, wrote one time that to be commanded to love God at all, let alone in the wilderness, is like being commanded to be well when we are sick, to sing for joy when we're dying of thirst, or to run when our legs are broken. But this is the first and greatest commandment nonetheless. Even in the wilderness, especially in the wilderness, you shall love him. What are the things that we learn from the wilderness experiences of Israel that help prepare us for the tough days in life? And what are the things that we might see in others, even the world community at large, when times get tough and chaos seems to prevail? First, let me mention, if you're a note taker, I'm going to try to quickly mention 7 things, and we'll write more about each of the 7 at a later date. But these are things that stand out to me from the wilderness narrative, that if we were reading it like a diary, these would be the 7 primary entries. First, moods tend to swing without notice in the wilderness. Please don't look at your spouse. Moods tend to swing in the wilderness without notice. Mood swings, personal changes in emotion, unsettled temperaments that can often become volatile are common in the wilderness. In the text we've read today from Exodus 17, the people grumbled and complained even more than they did when they were under the oppression of Egypt. Even Moses himself was affected. This gifted leader who had obeyed God reluctantly struck a rock in haste when earlier God had commanded him to speak to the rock rather than striking it. Be cautious. When times are tough, our moods can swing. Second, it's true for most of us, if not all of us, doubts multiply in the wilderness. In this text and in this story, the people doubted God. They doubted their leaders. They doubted each other, and they doubted themselves. Maybe it's because there are more unknowns in the wilderness. For a group of people, for an individual, for a family, and for a congregation. There are more unknowns in the wilderness. Specifically in this text, they doubted whether they should have left Egypt. They doubted whether Moses was the right leader. They doubted where their provision might come from. They doubted whether they would ever make it to the other side of this blasted wilderness. And ultimately, they doubted whether God was with them at all. Have you ever been there? Have one or more of those characterized your doubts? Or perhaps it's all of those and even more. One of the things that happened, by the way, was they had a bad case of the let's go back to Egypt syndrome. Psychologically, and from a counseling perspective, we all experience that. Our memories of yesterday, though selective, are always better than the circumstances we're in, at least for the most part. And we have this idea, if we could just go back to the way our ancestors had it, if we could just go back to the simplicity of high school, if we could just go back to the way things used to be, if we could just go back when gas was 36 cents a gallon, if we could just go back to the way church was in the 1950s. They kept saying to Moses, we'd been better off if you'd left us in Egypt. How did we get here? Doubts multiply in the wilderness. But here's the good news. God provides for us in surprising ways, even in the wilderness experiences of life. I was heavily influenced in a most positive way by Depression-era grandparents who knew the quest for daily provision. They gave me a great appreciation for having food on the table and clothes on my back. Israel had known both seasons of feasting and seasons of famine, but the wilderness brought entirely new lessons in trust and stewardship. God provided quail from an unusual source. God provided manna fallen from the sky. But the manna was given in such a way as it couldn't be preserved. It couldn't be refrigerated. It couldn't be dehydrated. It couldn't be packaged and saved for tomorrow. And each person was given only what they needed for today. And if you took more, it tended to mold or spoil. Like most of our blessings, manna has a short shelf life. And it requires that we trust the God who provided manna today, and we trust the God who provided our manna for yesterday, that God will indeed provide manna for tomorrow. The manna principle, no matter what your tasks are, ask God for enough provisions to get you through today and trust that God will provide for all of our tomorrows. But there were some who hoarded the manna. There were some who wouldn't share the manna. They gathered more while others had none to survive on. Maybe that's the reason Jesus himself when he gave us that model prayer, prayed, Lord, give us today our daily bread, our daily provision, our daily sustenance. God didn't provide them enough to retire on through one journey in the wilderness. In their anxiety and in their fear over their circumstances, they began to lose hope and lose faith. And all of a sudden, the attraction was more toward the things of the world than they were the things of God. Maybe there's a lesson for us to avoid the attraction of idols in the wilderness. For in the wilderness, there's often a temptation to turn to idols, to immediate gratification, whether physical or metaphorical, as a source of comfort or as a source of security. The Hebrew people faced this temptation with that story of the golden calf. We must be vigilant ourselves, even in the 21st century, not to replace God with worldly substitutes that have fleeting satisfaction. And before we jump on them too much by saying, how could they melt all their jewelry? How could they turn away from the commandments God had given Moses? How could they create this golden calf? We need to admit that in the 21st century, the golden calf construction company is still in business. We build monuments to our own self-sufficiency and thereby declare that God is insufficient. The golden calf construction company can still build luxury homes, amusement park-style malls, high-tech sports arenas. Are these things bad? No, not necessarily, but they are when they distract us from the all-sufficiency of God. There is a simple test to determine whether something is an idol in our life, whether it's our sports and recreation or our kids' sports and recreation, whether it's our possessions or our portfolio. There's a simple little test that helps determine whether something's an idol. This is the question: does it help you keep the commandments or cause you to break them? Does it help you more closely follow Jesus, or does it distract you from following Jesus? Any possession, any treasure, any relationship, or any avocation that causes us to break God's commandments is an idol. Any priority, any agenda, any allegiance, or any commitment that leads us away from Jesus rather than toward Jesus is an idol. And it's important in the wilderness to avoid the attraction of idols. Number 5, it's important to cooperate with fellow travelers in the wilderness. We could go on and on about this, but have you thought about the logistics of traveling with hundreds of thousands of people? What we're trying to see on the TV today of millions of people leaving one area, going to another without electricity, without water, and even with modern transportation and some cell phone communication, the UN has said it's impossible. Moses was trying to move one segment of a population together across a wilderness, some of which had highways that were used for trade and mercantile, and others which were totally unexplored. Think of the food needs. Think of the hygiene needs. Think of the friction in relationships. It seems virtually impossible. The only way they did it was finally agreeing to cooperate with one another. The Hebrew people had to cooperate and work with one another as a community to navigate the challenges of the wilderness together. And likewise, in our own desolate experiences, in our own challenging seasons, we have to support and cooperate with our fellow travelers, even if they're not like us, even if they don't look like us, think like us, or vote like us. Our friends, our family, and our faith community are invaluable, but we're different. And we're called to set aside some of our opinions and some of our perspectives in order to survive the wilderness experiences of life. The Hebrew people spent 40 years in the wilderness. It's a journey that should have taken far less time, but it took them longer to decide to work together as a team. And that's true of most wilderness experiences. Once we get to the point we're not determined to have it our way, and we work together with the larger group of people in the common good, the caravan begins to move forward. In our own desolate seasons, it's important to trust God. All these years later, people of God and families of faith and congregations are called to teamwork in every endeavor. And number 6, and this may be the toughest of all for people like me, maybe not for you, is to be patient with God's timeline, especially in the wilderness. The Wilderness Diaries, when we read the whole story, reminds us that God's timeline may not always align with our own. The Hebrew people spent 40 years in the wilderness. I struggle with spending 24 hours in the wilderness. In our own desolate seasons, patience with God's timing is absolutely imperative. And even the journey we're on as a congregation requires patience, or far too easily we will give up hope and throw in the towel when we're actually closer to the promised land than we've ever been before. Finally, number 7, to underscore what the people of Israel learned out of their firm resolve under Moses' leadership is to trust God in all circumstances. For trust grows deeper even in the wilderness. Moses went to the top of the mountain and had an experience of God that not everyone in the caravan had. And when he returned, he was so dismayed that you remember the story even before you saw Charlton Heston do it on screen. Moses took the tablets and threw them down in disgust and broke them, almost saying, "What's the use?" The people of God had decided that they could build an idol with their silver and gold and jewelry and things of value that was greater than the God they served. What a terrible mistake. But if you follow the story through, that's not the end of the story. They melted down the idol because the idol could not fulfill the need that they had, and neither can the idols we erect in our own lives. So before long, here in the middle of the wilderness, the golden calf comes down, and the people began to grow deeper in the trust in God who has led them this far. Because when they stopped to think about it, they really did not want to go back to Egypt. They did not want to confront Pharaoh's army. And for sure, they didn't know exactly what the future held, but they began to believe that the God who was leading them would see them through to their destination. Eventually, as we grow in our faith and our friendship, trust in God triumphs over temptation for the people to track on toward the promises God has provided. Which leads me to a few things in conclusion. From the Wilderness Diaries, we can learn valuable lessons that strengthen us as individual believers and as a family of faith. And we can learn things that sustain us in the most desolate experiences of life. And we can watch the news with hope that regardless of the chaos and the atrocity, it's not yet the end of the story. I'd like to close with 2 things. One question I've been asked this week I would like to try to answer. And the other is to leave you with a little bit of a 3-point challenge. First, this text talks about the children of Israel leaving Egypt. And when we pick up in chapter 17, they're coming through the wilderness of sin. Where are they going? They're going to the promised land. Where was the promised land? It was called the land of Canaan. Here's the question I was asked. Where is the land of Canaan today? Egypt is still almost in the same place today that was in when the Exodus took place. When you look at today's map, The wilderness of Sinai and the wilderness peninsula are almost in the same location. But the children of Israel crossed over into the land of Canaan in an area that's very close to what you see on the news being the possible southern border of Gaza into Egypt. And when we read the stories of ancient Philistia, Philistia in the Bible is where Gaza mostly is today. So the question is, where's Canaan? Modern day Canaan now encompasses Israel, Gaza, Jordan, Palestine, the West Banks, and the southernmost parts of Lebanon and Syria. Canaan was originally situated in what's called the southern Levant, which today is the areas that I just mentioned. But oftentimes in Scripture, it's called the land flowing with milk and honey, or the promised land. If the land of Canaan, on the most fertile crescent in the Middle East, was the land they journeyed to, what is the promised land for us? It's possibly twofold. One, some Christians tend to equate the promise of heaven, the promised place, where Jesus in John 14 says, I go to prepare a place for you, and will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. So some equate the promised land for us, our ultimate destination, as being heaven, the heavenly city, or what in Revelation is called the New Jerusalem. But another way of looking at the promised land is being in the very presence of God, both here, now, and then. That the promised land is realizing that wherever you go, God is there. And in every circumstance, God is with us. Here's the 3-point challenge. First, this week, I would like for all of us to do what we've probably already been doing, to pray for the people of Israel and Palestine. That it's not just one or the other. When men, women, children, grandmothers, and babies die, it doesn't matter which side of the border it's on, it's a tragedy. And I personally have friends on both sides. And if Jesus were here, he wouldn't just be praying for one side. He would be praying for all the people and for a lasting peace. Second, stay informed. Go back and read the biblical text. And when you watch the news, look the places up on the map, for these are places we learned about in Sunday school. And third, because we have a lot of Jewish and Israeli and Palestinian people living around us and in our workplace and in our school, seek them out and say an encouraging word. I have 2 very close rabbi friends, and this week I contacted both of them to assure them of my prayers and the prayers of our congregation. When I am able to get in touch with my Palestinian friends, I will do the same, because their world is collapsing. And what we see as merely chaos from the distance, they are living that chaos with many of their immediate family members in the midst of it. And one final thing. Did you notice at the end of the text I read, there was one question that kept perplexing them, and it's hard to believe that after God led them out of Israel, and after God parted the sea, and after God gave manna from on high, and after God provided water from the rock, and after God rained quail from heaven, they have the audacity to say, is God with us or not? And yet in the wilderness experiences of life, we can ask the same question. And the answer to that question is that no matter what you and I face and what circumstances confront our world, God is with us. God is with us, especially in the wilderness experiences of life.